All right. So we are going to try to wrap up our series that we've been discussing on basically we've kind of been covering the book Have Atheists Prove There Is No God, which is a book that was written by Thomas Warren back in the, I forget what I had said. I didn't bring it in with me to look at the date, but it was either, I think it was around the 70s. And that kind of came in with what we're studying because we're going through a series on Job. And in that series on Job, of course, a big discussion happens is going to be done between Job and his friends about why is Job suffering the way he is. You know, does God punish the evildoer kind of based on level of how bad he's done? Or does he reward those who have done good based on how good? And we kind of see that discussion today. We call it the prosperity gospel, where people, you know, the better you serve God, the better, the more blessed you're going to be, or the more you give back to God, the more blessed you're going to be. And that's true, though not in the way it's often taught, right? It's true that we are blessed by serving God, and we're blessed by giving to God and helping others, but those blessings are not necessarily material. It's also not true that it can be true that we sometimes are punished in relation to our sin, or what you might call punishment, in that there's consequences to sin, and we might see that consequence as a result. But we also may not. Some people are rewarded when they do wrong. So we don't know either way, and we talked about why that's the case. And that is the case because God, there's two founding things that really I hope you kind of get out of this series of lessons. One is, you know, that, of course, the main thing, God, there is not a contradiction between the God of the Bible and the fact that this world has evil in it. That's the big thing, because that's where atheists try to prove that there cannot be a God of the Bible. We've talked about that a lot. You know, God's all good, God's all powerful, so how can evil exist? And I think we explained that, hopefully, as well as we can, that the evil exists simply because God gives us a choice. And as an inherent part of that choice comes evil, because evil is not doing God's will. So hopefully that answers that question. But then we've also spent a lot of time talking about pain and suffering, and how does that work? And that goes back to, once again, that choice, but also the fact that God created this world to allow us that choice. It's the perfect world for us to be able to see that God exists, but at the same time for him not to force himself on us to the point where we have no choice but to follow him. We're given that choice, and the world was created in a way that allows us to make that decision. And so what Thomas Warren says is that every instance of all these things that are considered pain and suffering that people have a problem with is a part of that world that God created, that world that's meant for that purpose. And when did it become that kind of a world? Well, after Adam and Eve sinned, we know that there was a change that occurred. And we're going to see, actually, and there's another time where there was another change, not to the same extent as what happened with Adam and Eve, but in our environment, in the world. And you probably know what I'm talking about there. The flood significantly changed our environment. And what happened after the flood? People started living not as long, right? They didn't last as long after that. So we see all those things occur. So where we're at right now is I was doing a little bit, and I just thought it was worth doing this while we were talking about these things. I was reading, we ended last week, I was reading a part of a chapter from a book called Fortify Your Faith by Wayne Jackson, once again written in the 70s. And this is kind of a Christian evidences book, but he specifically addresses some about evil, pain, and suffering, and the place that we were reading specifically was dealing with atheism and kind of the contradiction to atheism, not necessarily dealing with it the same way we have been, but just some of the problems that the belief of atheism has. So I'm going to pick back up there. And like I said, I don't necessarily like to read, but I think that he puts some of this better than I could, and so it just makes sense to just kind of go through this. We'll read a couple pages here at the end of this first chapter, and then we'll kind of back up, and I wanted to read a little bit in the middle of the chapter as well. But this is what he calls this is atheism's creed. And I had read the first couple last week, but we're going to start back at the beginning just so you can get the full gist of this. The other thing that I mentioned last week while we were reading this that he's specifically talking about here, when he's talking about this, when he wrote this, at the time, there seemed to be a pretty big movement toward religion, I believe, and most scientists at this point, and I quote, most scientists were of the belief that there was a creator. They had come to that conclusion, and they said it out loud because that was what the evidence pointed to. Now, I still would argue that that's still the case. However, I think we've seen in our society today that political pressure and other things going on in social media and things like that, that's not necessarily the case today. I don't know how many scientists would out loud say, oh, there has to be a creator. I don't know. I don't know if there's been a study on that. I'm not sure. But I have a feeling that might be tilted the other way a little bit now with the way things are going, but I could be wrong. Maybe they still would say that. I don't know. All right, so anyway, atheism's creed. Before concluding this discussion on atheism, we feel compelled to call attention to the atheist's smug self-image of his totally scientific and rational outlook. He feels that faith is irrational and thus allegedly disassociates himself from such. The truth is, however, it actually requires more faith, and that of an unreasonable variety, to accept atheism than theism. The atheist does indeed have a faith. James D. Bales discusses some of the articles of faith in the Atheist Creed in his book, Communism, Its Faith and Fallacies. The following is an adaptation of some of his points. That's another point that I meant to make, that I wanted to make that I didn't make last week. He talks about communism as basically as a religion, and we see elements of that today as well in other areas, environmentalism and other things. We see that creeping heavily into what's going on here in our society today. Though the atheist cannot prove it, he believes that God does not exist. To know that God does not exist, one would have to know everything and to be everywhere. For the thing which he did not know might prove God's existence. He would have to know all the causes which have ever operated, for the one cause he did not know might be God. The person who possessed such characteristics would be a God himself. Thus, an atheist, to be consistent, must be an autotheist, a self-God. There are no real atheists, only self-worshipping idolaters who have defied their own beings. The atheist cannot reverse this argument and say that one must know all in order to have sufficient reason to believe in God. Several lines of evidence show that it is rational to accept God and irrational to reject God. We need to know at least some of the evidence, but we do not need to know everything. So in other words, to know that God doesn't exist, you'd have to know everything, basically, because what you didn't know might be that evidence. But to know that God does exist, you don't have to have all the evidence. We just have to have sufficient evidence to come to a reasonable conclusion that God exists, which is what we've been talking about throughout the lessons. Is there sufficient evidence that God exists? Yes. So that's basically what the argument is there, is that you can't flip that and say, well, a Christian or a person who believes in God has to be able to prove conclusively that God exists. But you would have to do it the other way. The atheist ridicules the concept of an eternal God, yet he himself believes in the eternal existence of matter. His belief in the eternal existence of matter is not only without reasonable evidence, it is contrary to one of the best established scientific laws, the second law of thermodynamics, which demonstrates that the universe is running down and hence had an origin. Also, it is much more reasonable to believe that a mind, i.e. God, produced matter, life, and human consciousness than to believe that matter created mind, consciousness, and intelligence. So it makes more sense to believe that something with a mind created the universe than it is to think that somehow things just came together and then our minds somehow developed out of that. Atheists believe that life spontaneously arose from non-living matter. Again, this is contrary to the evidence suggested by the law of biogenesis, which affirms that life can only come from pre-existing life. The theory of spontaneous generation, as one unbeliever candidly admitted, is far from proven, and it is improbable that satisfactory proof will ever be forthcoming. I think that that's still the case. I think they're still trying to create life, but of course, even if they create what they might call life, it's coming from something that already exists. So they won't be able to create, they haven't ever been able to create something from nothing. Atheists believe that the order and design found in nature are simply the results of non-intelligent, non-conscious fate or chance. Atheists usually concede that there is at least apparent design and order in nature, which they attribute to irrational forces. This is totally contrary to all our experience, which reveals that design is the result of intelligence. Number 5, the atheist believes that consciousness evolved from a fortuitous combination of non-conscious molecules. He has no proof for this incredible view. Number 6, the atheist believes that non-moral matter created man with a moral sensitivity, a sense of obligation or duty. I appeal to your good sense. Does it seem reasonable to believe that primeval slime could evolve into a morally sensitive man? I think we talked about that a little bit, like what C.S. Lewis talks about with morality being a proof of an evidence of God. I mean, if you go across societies, most societies have similar, maybe not exactly the same, but similar senses of morality. So how did that happen? You know, how is it that everybody has a similar sense of morality, you would say a common sense, and of course he gets into much more detail and a much more discussion on it, but you kind of get the point where does our sense of morality come from? The atheist, to be consistent, must believe that man is merely a matter machine without any power of choice, and thus without any real responsibility for his conduct. How could matter, regardless of how refined it might be, decide between alternatives and be responsible for that decision? When the atheist acts as if he were a morally responsible being, he negates his own assertions. So how can there be good and bad if something doesn't dictate what's good and bad? It's just a question to think about. And then number 8, again, if consistent, atheists must believe that all thought is irrational, for it is all assumed to be the inevitable byproduct of irrational causes. According to atheism, mental processes are wholly determined by the physical movement of atoms in the brain. A couple of years back, I had a discussion with an atheist who contended that belief in God was not reasonable, since such belief was only the result of a human brain that had evolved from matter. It had apparently never occurred to him that if his reasoning was valid, the very atheism he was urging me to accept also was the product of an evolved brain of pure matter and therefore unworthy of my consideration. His line of argumentation was devastating to his position. As Bells has so succinctly observed, how strange it is that those who claim the name rationalist and maintain that theists are not rational should end up with a position which implies that all thought is irrational. So I think that just really kind of drives home the point of how illogical a lot of the arguments against God and the Bible are. That they basically argue against themselves whenever actually put through a logical test, whenever you actually think through and critically analyze what's being said. And I think that's true of a lot of things that we're seeing today. So I think as I always, you've probably heard me say it a lot, and I'll continue saying it. Think about it. Don't just listen to what somebody tells you. I don't care who it is, if it's me or whoever's talking. Think about it. Does it make sense? Rationalize it. Think it through. Well, don't rationalize it, but see, is it rational? Think, is it rational? Does it make sense? Is it logical? And think it through, because we're being fed a lot that simply is not true and not accurate. So, all right. So that was what he had to say on atheism. And like I said, that was several years ago, but I think it still holds very true. There have been maybe a few things that have advanced in science that some people might argue would change that a little bit, but I still don't think it holds out any change to any of those arguments or discussions.
I thought the argument, though, with atheism is that to be a true atheist, you say there is no God, but to say that, you have to admit there's the possibility of God's existence.
Yeah, that was his first point, was that you can't possibly know that, because how could you know that? Because you'd have to know everything. Making yourself a god. That was his point. Basically, you're a self-theist. Is that the right term? Yeah, you believe you're a god unto yourself in order to believe there is no God. Yeah, you have to be. All right, so let's start wrapping up this discussion that we've had on evil, suffering, and pain. After our discussion for the past several weeks, how might you respond to the atheist claim that there can be no God of the Bible because evil and suffering exist in the world? You just throw some things out that we've talked about. What are some things that how you might respond to somebody who asked you, who says, there's no way that I can believe in the God of the Bible because of everything I see around me, all the evil in the world, all the pain and suffering? What are some responses that we might have? Free choice. That's the first. That's, like I said, that's the ground level base foundation for why evil and pain and suffering. Why does it exist? Because God gives us the choice to serve Him or not to serve Him, and you might say that's where the rubber meets the road, or it's the crux of the argument. Evil, of course, means that we choose something that is against God's will, and evil exists because God gave us the freedom to choose something against His will. And it started off very simply. We talked about that, right? In the Garden of Eden, what could Adam and Eve do wrong in the Garden of Eden? Yeah, they could have neglected what God told them to do, which is they could have not taken care of the garden, because I think He gave them two commands: take care of the garden and don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was it. So that was it. And they chose to go against that will, against His will. And from there, everything else falls into place, you might say. Or falls out of place, maybe. It might be more of the right term. So what else? What are some other things that we talked about that would be important to be able to respond to that?
Just look at the human being, the complexity.
Okay, the complexity of the world, of humans, of just the universe, and to try to claim that just came from nothing. But that's still, even what I agree that that's certainly evidence of a creator. But even with that, people still would struggle with the problem of evil, pain, and suffering, right? I mean, that's still something that would cause doubt in our minds, or could cause doubt in our minds.
Well, with me, that doesn't cause doubt.
Right.
Because I am convinced there is a God. Look what God is the one that gives us life.
Right.
That right there should be proof positive that there is a God.
Yep. I agree.
To me, it's mind-boggling how someone.
Yeah, to me, it's much more logical to believe that something created this than to believe something didn't create this. But there are people who would argue the other way. We know that. What are some other things that we've discussed that might help in answering the problem of evil and suffering in the world? Or if you remember, we talked about what is the only intrinsic evil. Do you remember that terminology, intrinsic evil or inherent? For instance, whenever have you ever? Let me think. I'm trying to think of a good example here. Have you ever hit your thumb with a hammer and blamed it on the hammer, or something like that? No. Can the hammer ever have intent to hurt you? Can a tornado have intent to hurt somebody? So that
was the cabinet's fault that it hit the side of my head.
It was the cabinet's fault. so yeah, at the moment that it happens, we like to blame the inanimate object, right? But in reality, there's the only inherent evil is to not do God's will, to go against God's will. So in order to do that, you have to have a will of your own, which means people can commit evil. And that's the bottom line of that. And that's important because, once again, the big argument that the atheist feels that in the book that Thomas Warren was writing, in his response was to an atheist who felt like he had proven the God of the Bible didn't exist because of his argument. God is wholly good, God's omnipotent, all-powerful, so how can evil exist? And everybody agrees that evil exists. And that, I think, like I said, I feel like we've driven that home, that evil exists because God gave us the choice as to whether we're going to follow him or not. Another important thing that we talked about is that there are things that are not subject to power, at least not in the way that the atheist would argue it. And the example that I like that we use there is, no matter how powerful you are, at least in this current world, the way the world is, you can't have a four-sided triangle. That's not subject to power because the triangle is a three-sided shape. So that's not subject to power. Now, yeah, you could be powerful enough to change all the rules, which God is, but to do so would change the entire world. Like we wouldn't live in this world if that were the case. If you change that. So that argument, yes, you could say, well, God can make a four-sided triangle, but in order to do that, you'd have to change everything, and it just doesn't work. So that is not really subject to power in the world in which we live, because it just isn't logical. It just doesn't work. It defies all the laws that this world was created with. What are some other things? Anybody think of anything else that how you might respond to somebody who says they don't believe in the God of the Bible because of the evil and suffering that's out there?
This world's evolving every day. We're evolving every day. Where'd that come from?
Where did the changes?
Everything's evolving. It changes every day.
Yeah, and that's what we talked about a little bit. Like we know that scientists know that this world, the universe, is running down. It's not renewing itself. So there was a beginning, and where did that come from? And all of the things that have happened. And I'll kind of touch on that here in just a moment. This is another major one that we need to, and this one, once again, probably would not convince somebody necessarily, but it's an important part of this, and that is that much of the suffering in our world is caused by ourselves or by people. In fact, as we just mentioned, one could argue that all of it has been caused by people, because what caused evil and pain and suffering? Well, when Adam and Eve chose to disobey God. If you look at chapter 3 of Genesis, we see that decision being made and what happens after that. But God created a perfect world, and there was no death prior to that disobedience. So there were no natural disasters, diseases, or other things that cause pain and suffering the way they do now. So we are responsible for at least some of our pain and suffering. Not in every instance. We talked about that. How might we go have pain and suffering? Well, you might get a disease that wasn't any fault of your own. You might suffer through a natural disaster, not any fault of your own again. Somebody else might harm you, a person, not your own fault. So there are a number of ways that we get harmed by other things that are no fault of our own, but there are times where we do bring it on ourselves too. Like that happens as well. So like I said, it's not necessarily an answer as to why these things exist, but it is part of why they exist. It's part of it, at least. All right, so getting back to a little bit about what Terry was saying there, things have been changing and continue to change. The early humans lived to be very old by our standards, right? We see the ages in Genesis. Adam was 930, Methuselah was 969, Noah was 950. And of course, Noah was the last one before the flood, right? And so originally, people were designed to live forever. There was no death, no decay. And many scholars believe that the Earth's atmosphere was very different before the flood. And that's what I wanted to read a little bit about here as well from Wayne Jackson's book, Fortify Your Faith. I'm going to read a bit of page 6 and 7 here. It says, as we look back on it from our weakened condition, the physical vigor of our early parents was phenomenal. Adam lived to the age of 930 years. When I start reading this, it makes me think about, there's a song, something about when you only have 100 years to live. And I'm like thinking, how many people live to be 100? We don't really have 100 years to live. At least I wouldn't count on it. We have less than 100 years to live. But anyway, so here it says, Adam lived to the age of 930. Just imagine, when he was more than 4½ centuries old, he might have been comparable to a 35-year-old man of our day. Many of those ancients lived to very great ages. Methuselah was 969 years old at the time of his demise. Noah expired at 950 years, and this brings me to another point which I wish to make. After the great flood of Noah's day, there began to be decreasing human longevity. Shem, Noah's son, lived 600 years. And a few generations later, Peleg lived to be only 239 years. By the time of Abraham, man's age was drastically reduced, for that patriarch reached only 175 years, which was considered to be a good old age. Now, many scholars believe that the flood had something to do with the progressive weakening of man. The geophysical evidence indicates that a worldwide warm greenhouse-like climate was characteristic of the pre-flood world. Now then, if you're an atheist, that might be, what, the dinosaur age? The Jurassic age? I know they have all those different paleo age, whatever, all those different ages. It's been a while since I've studied it, so I can't tell you all of them, but I only remember Jurassic because the movies, Jurassic Park, and they said that that's not even, they don't even have dinosaurs from the Jurassic age in that movie. But anyway, there's a lot of these different ages, so they might be going back into those prehistoric ages and stuff like that. But that's what that makes me think of. Rehwinkel quotes Professor Alfred Wallace as follows: there is but one climate known to the ancient fossil world as revealed by the plants and animals entombed in the rocks, and the climate was a mantle of spring-like loveliness which seems to have prevailed continuously over the whole globe. What was the cause of this ideal climate, and what precipitated the changes resulting in our present climatic conditions? First of all, it is suggested by some that the earth of the antediluvian world was encased by a canopy of water vapor. According to this view, the earth was originally surrounded by a canopy of vapor which intercepted the direct rays of the sun. The heat which penetrated the canopy was diffused so equally over all the zones of latitude that the subtropical climate prevailed even in the high latitude. This canopy served to bring about conditions similar to those in a hothouse with a temperature of about 72 degrees. The chemical rays of the sun, those that bring about decay and fermentation, were intercepted by the canopy, and as a result, man and animals lived to great ages. There are several biblical passages which seem to corroborate this concept. For example, the creation account speaks of the waters above the firmament. And again, there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. That's in Genesis 2:6. Now, what has this to do with the problem of disease and suffering? Well, simply this: the flood was brought upon the ancient world because of the unchecked wickedness of a rebellious race. And Jehovah saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. Not only did that deluge destroy the entire human race, with the exception of 8 souls, but it undoubtedly dissipated the vaporous blanket shielding the earth. As a result, man was greatly weakened. Hence, he and his progeny became vulnerable to many maladies which probably did not affect them prior to this time. In this regard, Whitcomb and Morris have written, the declining lifespan after the flood seems to fit in perfectly with our concept of the dissipation of the earth's protective blanket during the flood. And as we have noted, this canopy of water vapor, with probably also large amounts of carbon dioxide and ozone augmenting the effect, provided a warm, pleasant, presumably healthy environment throughout the world. Perhaps the most important effect of the canopy was the shielding action provided against the intense radiations impinging upon the earth from space. Short-wavelength radiation, as well as bombardment of elementary particles of all kinds, is known to have damaging effects, both somatic and genetic effects on organisms, and this is generally true for all types of radiations. Thus again, sin is seen as a devastating contributor to man's agonizing condition. So think about that a little bit as far as climate change goes. That was a big climate change event there. also offers maybe some different lines of thought as far as that goes. But the main point being that we see that the conditions of the earth changed and pain and suffering were increased as a result of that. Once again, a direct result of people sinning. So that's what we see there. As we've also talked about, suffering as a natural consequence of sin. There are things that have been put in place to punish sin. If you participate in premarital sex or other improper sexual activities, you may get a sexually transmitted disease. If you drink and drive, you may be in an accident. If you take drugs, you may OD. Like, these things are just part of what we know can happen if we do something we're not supposed to. And also, the other thing that we talked about is that there are some benefits to pain and suffering, right? Pain can serve as a sentry to warn us when there is something wrong. We talked about how many times do you touch a hot oven before you figure out that you shouldn't touch a hot oven? That's because of pain. It's a signal to us. We talked about how natural disasters can teach us that we're not in control, that things are temporary, that we shouldn't rely on the material things that we collect, because how quickly can they be gone? Earthquake could wipe them out just like that. Tornado, wipe it out just like that. Hurricane, any number of things can just wipe things out. Suffering also keeps us from falling in love with this world and not thinking about the next and how important that is. It can also we talked about how the good things in this world can kind of lead us toward thinking about how good heaven's going to be, while the bad things that we see can be kind of a preliminary or teaching us about how bad hell's going to be. Like, we can use those things. And suffering also allows people to show how good our character is. If there were no suffering in the world, we could not show fortitude, bravery, patience, compassion, sympathy, self-sacrifice. We talk about, when you think about noble character or good character, what comes to mind, we just not celebrated, but we just remembered 9/11 a couple, 3 weeks ago now, 3 weeks ago. The 20 years. And you think, what do you think about? You think about the firemen and the police officers running into that building trying to save people. That if there was no opportunity for harm or anything, what would have been noble about that? There wouldn't have been anything special about it if there was no opportunity for harm or suffering or anything like that. But it was a brave thing to do, and it was a noble thing to do, because there was the chance for harm, because they could be injured or killed doing that. So it's a part of our world, the opportunity for pain and suffering, and we can learn things from it. All right, so one final question here. I guess we are going to be about perfect on time here to wrap this up and not. I was thinking we might get into Job and actually, after several weeks here, get back into reading some of Job, but we didn't quite make it. But so what are some other benefits of human suffering? What are some things that, obviously none of us wants to go through suffering. We don't enjoy it. We don't want to do it. But what are some of the benefits that do come as a result of pain and suffering? Or what does it allow us to do, I guess might be a better way of asking that. What does it allow for?
It can help us reflect more towards God and
More.
our faith.
Yeah, well, just like
Direction.
yeah, going back to 9/11, do you remember what happened right after that? Wasn't there sort of a religious revival? Now, that's good and bad. It's good that people did turn to God for a little bit, but it's also bad in that it didn't last very long, and people a lot of people tend to only turn to God when there's a problem. We've talked about that. That's our character. We should be the same when things are going good and bad. We should be relying on God at all times. But we see that sometimes, that doesn't happen. But it gives us an opportunity to cry out to God, to seek God in our lives. When we're going through a bad time, where do you turn? You turn to God. What else? A couple other things here. It can give us it gives us a life of self-denial. There again, example. Everybody knows the example of a monk, right? Own no physical material things, and it's a life of self-denial. Well, although I don't think that we need to go to that extent, we should deny ourselves some of the pleasures that people consider to be enjoyable as Christians. It's a differentiating factor in how we live our lives. It also gives us the opportunity to grow and develop in moral character. Well, I had a couple of scriptures here to read. James 1, 2 through 4. I don't think we've read any scripture, but we're going to end on some scriptures here. Okay. James 1, 2 through 4.
Can you hear me? Okay, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing.
All right, so it allows us to develop and grow. Also, it gives us a place to show our love for God and our faith, and it gives an opportunity for our faith in God to be tested. 1 Peter 1, 6 through 9.
In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls.
All right, so we can see that it allows for testing. It also gives God an opportunity to chastise us as his children. Revelation 3:19.
As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Therefore, be zealous and repent.
All right, so when we suffer, it may help to lead us to repentance. It allows for God to influence, there again, us to turn back to him when we might be doing something wrong. It allows for us to have a chance to reevaluate our attitude and our action. I was watching a movie last week, I think it was, and the guy was talking about how he had to be broken before he ever would turn back to God. Now, that's good and bad. It's good that he turned back after he was broken, but what about people who never get broken, who don't ever turn to God? That's something that we need to consider, how we can stir people to think about turning to God, even when the times are good. It gives us an opportunity to grow in compassion and love for others. When we see others suffering, we can grow in compassion and love for them. Helps us to better appreciate the good times and the love that God has for us. And finally, we'll end on this, it allows us to look forward to a place where there will be no more suffering. We're going to read Revelation 7, 15 through 17 here.
Therefore they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes.
All right, so seeing the pain and suffering here, what does it do? It allows us to look forward to a place where we know that's not going to happen anymore, that those things aren't going to exist anymore. There will be no more evil, pain, or suffering when we get to heaven. All right, thanks for your comments. And like I said, next week we're going to pick back up with Job chapter 3 and start talking, going through the scripture again on that.